So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Monica O. Montgomery, the Director of Community Engagement and Programs for Historic Germantown in Northwest Philadelphia. Monica believes museums must be in service to society. And I would say that that's something that I think I'm now in my 8th year as Deputy Director, I'm starting to forget. We've moved more and more in that direction here. So it's a very welcome perspective. She recently took up her role as Director of Community Engagement and Programs for Historic Germantown in Northwest Philadelphia, and previously served as Curator of Social Justice and Programming for the Futures exhibit celebrating the Smithsonian's 175th anniversary. She has curated exhibits with renowned organizations like the South African Embassy, Brooklyn Museum, Portland Art Museum, and the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center, and has worked as a consultant for museums and other institutions on DEI and community engagement. Additionally, Monica has taught graduate courses around museums, community engagement, and social justice at American University, Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, the Pratt Institute, and New York University. She has a BA in broadcast communication from Temple, and an MA in corporate communication from LaSalle. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from Monica about the museum as a revolutionary icon. Perhaps this will be our favorite revolutionary of the series. So please join me now in welcoming Monica.
Hello. Oh, let's try it again. Hello. Hi. It's good to see you all who are here in person and those who are joining virtually. Hello. My name is Monica O. Montgomery, and while my slides are being loaded, I'd like to read a land and labor acknowledgement that I've written. In a spirit of gratitude, we acknowledge those indigenous, enslaved, emancipated, and liberated ancestors, foremothers and forefathers, those who came before, those who paved the way, those who migrated and traveled long distances in a variety of circumstances, who keep the culture and who steward the land. We acknowledge a need for remedy in a landscape of inequity. And may we do our part to repair and restore the debt of tears owed to those persons, those Native American nations, such as the Lenape, and those Black Indigenous persons of color. We honor the global majority, their livelihood and presence across generations. Thank you. So, without further ado, it's really great to address you all. I'm guessing if you're in this room or in this virtual room, you're a museum lover. Raise your hand. Anyone? Yes, because we're here in a museum. So I also am a museum lover. And basically that long bio that the Deputy Director generously read just means that I love museums. I've worked in them for a decade. This is my decade anniversary in museums. And even before I worked in them, I volunteered, I visited as a child, as a college student, as an adult. And I've always been really enamored with the promise and the potential of museums. So today we're going to talk about what does it look like when a museum is a revolutionary icon? And what is that process? And who is embarking on that work? I wanted to know, you know what? I'm going to wait on that one. I have a question for you all. This is not just going to be a monologue, but a dialogue, but we'll get to that in a moment. I will say that there are many signs that museums as institutions are moving towards spaces of progress and best practice. So I'm going to tell you a little about my journey in museums. There are some pictures of me, and then there'll be pictures of others. Let's see if I can get this correct. One second while I learn this system. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So these are some images of me at the Smithsonian exhibit that I was part of curating called the Futures exhibit. It's on display now at the Arts and Industries building, which is next to the Smithsonian Castle. It'll be up until July, so you have about a month left to see it, and I do hope you're able to go. And that exhibit, just to briefly touch on it, is really about what is the future that we hope for and not the future that we fear? What does it look like to try to tackle some of the intractable social issues like climate and food and justice and make solutions or explore solutions that can come out of them in the next 3 generations? So this is an exhibit that has been years in the making. It's celebrating the Smithsonian as an engine of the future, and we have all sorts of technology, innovations, historic artifacts, and art commissions looking at futurism in a hopeful, equitable, and sustainable vein. But this moment where I was able to speak at the Smithsonian and address the Secretary Lonnie Bunch and all of the hundreds and thousands of visitors that have come through was not overnight. This was years in the making. And I really feel that in this career, I have been able to start from the bottom and work my way up. And so the revolution has been a personal revolution as a museum worker, as well as observing how the field has evolved and grown. When I first got into museums, I thought a lot about what is the role of a museum and how a museum can be part of the civic infrastructure, the part to play that is helping our humanity move forward, is helping us address and contextualize things. And when I first was talking about museums and social justice, people would look at me like I had 2 heads. They often didn't see a role for museums and social justice. I'm sorry, I'm just still trying to get the knack of this. Okay, I think I slipped. Sorry, skip the slide. No, okay. Sorry, this is not a laptop I am used to. Is this clicker working? Okay. Am I pointing at the screen? Excuse me, folks. I just need a little tutorial. Okay. It is not. In any event, when I first started in museums, and the journey of looking at social justice and how that can evolve, people didn't see a role for social justice in museums. People didn't imagine that that's something that could be fused together, right? Now, in this moment in time, we're good?
The arrows will work. So if it's not working, you can just do this.
Okay. Thank you. In this moment in time, it is more mainstream, right? When we think about exhibits, when we think about programs, when we think about all the work of a museum, it's very community-driven, and it's evolved, especially since 2020 and the pandemic and the racial reckoning and all of the crises and current events that have been happening. So when I broke down the meaning of revolution and icon, I wanted to share with you the definition that came up just in a quick Google search. Revolutionary: involving or causing a complete or dramatic change. Icon: that which is regarded as a representative symbol worthy of veneration. So if we put those together, I believe the ultimate question is asking, how can a museum catalyze change and care for its community? And what does it look like and feel like when you are cared for by a museum? Just so you don't think I'm kind of coming out with this out of thin air, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, they have a whole assessment that they do on museums and the skills that are needed to lead them. And they shared in 2009 that one of the 21st century leadership skills for a museum leader is the ability to act responsibly with the interest of the larger community in mind, and an institutional focus toward collaboration and community, envisioning a visitor-centered museum and what that could look like. There have been books written about museums and social justice, museums and community engagement, all of the things that we're discussing now, the things that we're witnessing shifts happening in our world. There was a book called Museum and Relevance that was written by Robert Janes. And Janes argues that a museum provides answers to fundamental questions. He says, at their very best, museums present the richness and diversity of life and keep reflection and dialogue alive for their visitors. Museums have the obligation to probe our humaneness. And in assuming this responsibility, museums are unique and valuable social institutions that have no suitable replacement. So we have major thinkers authors, and institutions speaking about what a museum has been and can be, but also we have to reflect you all, the general public, because there's no need to go off into museum studies land without talking about how the public interprets and experiences museums. I'm happy to say that as of last year, a 2021 report called Museums and Trust stated that the public continues to regard museums as highly trustworthy, second only to friends and family as a source of knowledge. Museums are ranking significantly higher than researchers and scientists, non-governmental organizations, news organizations, the government, corporations and businesses, and of course, social media. And 25% of those respondents say that they think museums are the #1 trusted source for information. So our sector is regarded highly, and we're very lucky to have that standing. There are 3 reasons why in this study, these people felt that museums are a very highly regarded, trustworthy source of information. Museums are fact-based, #1. Anything you see is fact-checked and vetted by many people before it ever reaches the label or the wall or the interpretive text. Museums present real, authentic, original objects. Now, mind you, there are some museums that have no objects, no artifact, that are more museums of ideas and media, but many museums have some sort of object, some sort of artifact, something that is being focused upon, even if that is digitized. And #3, museums are research-oriented. They're educational institutions. The Smithsonian is one of the largest educational institutions with research centers and think tanks all within this network of museums and zoos, aquariums and libraries. So it's good to know that even in this day and age, when there are many fake news outlets, museums are still highly regarded. And when you think about it, maybe you've had a formative learning experience in a museum. Maybe it was a field trip that you went on when you were a kid, and that's when the light of learning reached your eyes, and you started to understand more about the topic being explored. Maybe it was dinosaurs or bones, a natural history museum, or an American history museum, or a science center. Maybe you chaperoned a field trip for a child in your life that you're caregiving for, or that you wanted to help out a class that needed some extra adult chaperones. Perhaps there was a family day. You were able to take your family there or witness other families having an enjoyable time. And of course, tours. Many museums could not even make ends meet without the tours that they give, and that is a main source of the educational outreach and of revenue. So the work of museums, of course, is supposed to be human-centered, visitor-centered, and it should be highly regarded as trustworthy. And it's exciting to see that many people consider the museum space highly. But I want to talk a little bit beyond just the trust about what does it mean for a museum to be a good neighbor space. So when we think of a neighbor, we think of a person who cares, a person who is concerned about the well-being of the group or the community, someone who might look out for you, or you can maybe borrow a cup of sugar from. Do people still do that? Assumably they do. Someone who is going to have your back because you live in proximity and you're in community. So if a good neighbor space is a place where neighbors can go and gather, what are those spaces where we gather, or where we feel safe, or where we feel cared for, or where we feel welcome? Not too long ago, there was a lot of talk in the media about sanctuary cities and places where undocumented migrants and immigrants could go and be free from harassment by immigration authorities or those trying to deport them. And in that same vein, this is an image, or excuse me, both of these are images, one from Harvard University, one from a local church in Brooklyn, New York, where it is being announced that this is a sanctuary for those who are looking for it. And what a beautiful sentiment for these places, these civic infrastructures, to say, you're welcome here, you can come here, you're safe here. So what are those places, right? Even beyond this movement, what are the places in general when something happens, because something is always happening, where we can go? Is it a library? Is it a park? Is it a school? A church, a hospital, a mall? Could it be a museum? Could a museum actually radiate that care and make people feel welcome and safe and cared for, and encourage gathering? I think it could be. I think it would be so dynamic if many museums leaned into this ethos and tried that approach. And some of the museums that I'm going to speak about in the coming slides are on that precipice, are trying that approach, are trying to make their values visible to the communities that they serve, and ensuring that people know that they're there to be a resource, that all are welcome, and that all of those things that we just spoke about, where people would want to go to feel safe, can also happen in a museum space. So, as I was mentioning, in the midst of current events every week, new fresh levels of crazy, climate crises, pandemics, calamity, racial reckoning, you name it, whatever's happening in the world, I believe that a museum can help us grapple with these things and should help us grapple with these things. That a museum can evolve and that they are evolving to become these good neighbors and have spaces where neighborliness is welcome and to be equity focused. I also want to speak for a moment about equity. So when I talked to my students this past semester, I was teaching at Georgetown, and I asked them, what does equity look like? Because these are words that are oftentimes bandied about or shared, but people don't have an understanding of what does it truly look and feel like. My students shared 4 principles as they found consensus about what equity can feel and look like. They said that equity is an internal and an external posture. So that means if you are running an institution, equity has to happen within for your staff, your volunteers, your stakeholders, and externally so that the public can see it, feel it, taste it. They said that equity extends beyond the physical, and that equity is something that the values of your organization have to centralize. So it can't just be like, oh yeah, we did diversity and equity and inclusion in that one day 60-minute training. It needs to be more of an imperative, of a core business function that is woven into everything. And lastly, my students said that equity requires action. And I like that because it is an active term. It's about the righting of wrongs and the remedy and making sure everyone has the resources that they need to be successful. So if one person has a lot of resources and the other has none, well then the resources need to be given to those who have none to bring them up to speed, as opposed to just saying, well, they'll be okay if we just give them a little and them a little, which is an equality approach, but more so equity is about remedying historical erasures and those who do not have. So equity is a focus in museums and can go beyond an Ethnic Heritage Month. It can go beyond Pride Month. It can go beyond any sort of month of celebration if it is part of what is at the core and baked in. So during this talk, I want to give some examples of spaces that I think are operating in really dynamic ways, and the 4 kind of dimensions that we're going to look at for museums as revolutionary icons. Number 1, we're going to look at the institutional body language and values of some of these museum spaces and based on the things they have written and put out into the world. Number 2, we can really just oogle at the architecture, right? How striking is the building? What does that feel like? And what are some of the emotions that come up when you're in a space? Because some museums can be quite emotional and some are designed to be that way. Number 3, the socially responsive programs and community outreach that museums participate in, what they do beyond their exhibits, beyond the tour, and how that is so important to note that these museums are going above and beyond to meet the needs of the community. And number 4, the ethical returns, the collections policy, the repatriation. How did museums get their stuff? Was it gotten in a proper way? Is it ill-begotten gains? And what's being done about it? What's being done to right that wrong? So those are the 4 things we're going to look at. This is not an exhaustive list. There are probably more examples than we have time to share, but I welcome during the Q&A if you know of a museum doing great work, being a good neighbor, focusing on equity in your neck of the woods, virtually or here in the room, please do share so we can all visit and support that work. So, institutional body language and values. Each of these, I've shared a a quote from actual museum visitors. There's a blog called Visitors of Color, and they do what it sounds like, document the words and the thoughts and the nuance of what visitors of color are feeling when they visit museum spaces. And this person says, "I'd like to know that I count at my local museum." So this is our fair, forever, First Lady of the United States, Miss Michelle Obama. And she was present when the Whitney Museum reopened a few years ago. And she shared an interesting sentiment where most people were just celebrating the opening and the work of the Whitney. She talked about her lived experience. And she said, "There are so many kids in this country who look at places like museums and concert halls and other cultural centers, and they think to themselves, well, that's not a place for me. For someone who looks like me, for someone who comes from my neighborhood, they would never in a million years dream that they would be welcome in the museum." And growing up on the south side of Chicago, I was one of those kids myself. So I know the feeling of not belonging in a place like this. And her saying that caused a big stir, especially for those in the sector. A lot of people were incredulous. Some people applauded her forthrightness and her honesty. But ultimately, she gave voice to what a lot of people are feeling, that there is a palpable sense of not feeling welcome, not feeling like you belong. The term that we use in the field, and this was coined by Nina Simon, who's an amazing author and thinker, museum leader, it's called threshold fear, where there are people who are scared to just come to the door, walk through the door, ask a question because they don't think that they're welcome or they could afford it or that anybody will pay them any attention. Some people, there's a language barrier. Their mother tongue might not be English. Some people have accessibility considerations and they don't see that they could get their needs met in spaces. But that institutional, kind of body language combined with the threshold fear, the museum feeling and seeming standoffish combined with the individual feeling like that isn't for me, is what keeps a lot of people from visiting. And in the sector, this is something we're actively trying to overcome, which is the whole reason why museums have to be revolutionary icons, so they can radiate that welcoming and belonging and make sure that everyone feels able and that they can access the space and that they're welcome there, and no matter what they're showing up as or what language they speak or what clothes they're wearing, that they are welcome in space. Something else about institutional body language and museums, certainly we have to harken back to the summer of 2020, when George Floyd and many other African Americans were ruthlessly killed, some through extrajudicial means and police and vigilantes and all of these kinds of things. That summer raised the ire of so many people who felt that injustice was happening and justice needed to be served. And there was a whole outcry towards all sorts of spaces of what were they going to do. Corporations, nonprofits, and museums were also part of that fray. And the statements of demand, actual statements that you can Google towards major museums, were aimed to say, what are you all doing about this? And how are you making a more equitable space in your museum? So there are many community members that called out museums for the virtue signaling that they were doing and the performative statements. And these call-outs underscored the disparities in these museums, both in their internal and external practices. But I am happy to say, slowly and surely, some museums are progressing in the sector, and they're following through on those plans that they said, that they announced back in 2020. Slowly but surely, some of the structural changes around parity, labor, and shared authority are coming to bear fruit. Some of the things that were called out: decolonizing the imperialist collections. Many museums have items that were gotten through plunder and war. Contested artifacts that need repatriation or restitution. Cultural appropriation and suppressed narratives. In terms of internally, the staff, right? There's a lack of promotions, a lack of raises and upward mobility. Oftentimes, there's no pay transparency. When jobs are listed, there's no salary range put down. So people will apply for things, and ultimately they can't live on the salary that is offered. It's hard to negotiate, and oftentimes internships were unpaid and hopefully now are being paid as part of the best practice, and many other things that were being called out. So I see, as someone who consults in the sector, who teaches, who also works, I see some changes. I see some glimmers of hope. It's not perfect. There's a long way to go, and many museums have to do this work. But at least this moment brought to a tipping point what had been going wrong so that it could be publicly announced and corrected. Speaking of statements of solidarity, if we do walk down memory lane back to 2020, I included a few here just so you can see the tone and the tenor of what's being shared or what was being shared on social media. The National Museums of Liverpool issued a statement. At the end, I found it poignant that they said, "George Floyd, we remember, we act." There was a whole movement in theaters where theater groups were encouraged to open their lobbies for protesters who were out, oftentimes being harassed and mistreated, and who needed a place to kind of get rest, drink water, use the facilities. And so that was another call out, and this was a social media meme in support of that. This is from the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. And I'll just read the opening sentence of their statement of solidarity. It says that they join in the solidarity and the pain and outrage over the murder of George Floyd. The museum stands solidly behind Kansas City's pursuit of social justice and champions human expression. So there is actually a database of about 500 of these statements that I have access to that I believe is publicly accessible. Some students put in the time and the work so that this moment in history won't be forgotten, and that we can hold institutions who made these announcements, hold their feet to the fire to ensure that they live up to the words that they have shared. Some more to think about in terms of institutional body language values and accountability. There are some really great things happening in California. Some museums are sharing what's called impact reports, almost like a report card of what they've been doing and how they've lived up to what they said they would do or where there's room for growth. The Museum of Us in San Diego, well, they shared what they called an accountability report. And they actually used to be called something different. They have a new brand identity. They were called the Museum of Man. And it was another anthropological museum, but realizing that that language is a bit dated and not inclusive, they decided to go through a rebrand, and they had a contest for people to submit names of what they should call themselves. And after many months and much voting, the Museum of Us emerged. Some of the other things they have shared in this accountability report, and again, all of this is publicly accessible on the museum's website. Every resource I shared can be found online. They've created more full-time positions from the part-time positions that oftentimes leave many of the museum workers in precarity, working 5 or 6 jobs, 3 to 4 jobs just to make a full-time salary. They factored a cost of living increase for their workers. 64% of their new staff hired are BIPOC, means Black, Indigenous persons of color, and 47% of the total staff are BIPOC, and 45% of the board. Also, just across the way from San Diego over to Oakland, in the Bay, the Oakland Museum of California, they have shared an impact report, and they're doing some dynamic work. I'm friendly with some folks that work there. They are celebrating celebrations like Lunar New Year, Dia de los Muertos, and others. This was at the height of the pandemic when I believe they had to close the building. There were 900 school groups served through virtual field trips, 13 learn-at-home activities, and on and on. And so it's great when a museum as a space doesn't just open and close its doors, but shares transparently about what it's doing and its activities and what can happen if it commits to these values of being revolutionary. Another museums' revolutionary icon tenet, striking architecture and strong emotion. Now, I'm not an architecture buff, but I did include some pictures that we can all ooh and ah over together and get a sense of the feeling of some of the spaces that these places occupy. This museum worker, again from the Visitors of Color blog, says, museums have always been a platform where the past, the present, the future converge. And workers in the museum are seeking transformative inclusion, choosing to actively engage with these timelines and all of the voices present in each. So this is the front of the Futures exhibition. So you'll see a nice shiny dichroic glass, kind of soft sculpture covering the front. We wanted to make it look different than any other Smithsonian, and it does draw in many crowds. And again, this building was the first building in the Smithsonian portfolio. It was the National Museum, and that space incubated many of the other museums. It's also hosted inaugurations and many celebrations in its day. It was closed for 50 years, reopened just for Futures, and then it's going to close back again for renovations. But it is a grand palatial space. Thinking again about emotions and architecture, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City, which sits on the site of the former Twin Towers, where those towers have fallen. There is a kind of reflection pool, a very large-scale one in both sites. And they've created a peaceful, tranquil garden atmosphere, although it has a lot of tourists and it's very busy, but one can reflect. I'm a native New Yorker, and so this museum especially has a lot of resonance for me. And when I went through, I cried, and I think it is designed for people to cry and to feel those feelings. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. This space, founded by Bryan Stevenson, who is a noted human rights, civil rights lawyer, honors African Americans who have been lynched, and has soil samples from many of the spaces where documented lynchings occurred, and that is placed in the museum alongside of this sculpture that hangs from the top. There's also many other components to this space I highly recommend to visit, and it is also designed to be a somber space. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, for those of you who have been, it's a great space. I'm sure it was a lot to process, and those who haven't, please do take a day or two and go and visit. But one of the things I love, I was there at the opening and even before construction, I know the team well. One of the things I love is that they have a contemplation court, just a space that you can sit, you can watch the water fall in a ring, and that's in the middle of the room. There's benches on each side, there's quotes on the wall, and just process all you've seen. Sometimes when you go through a heavy museum experience like that, you need something to help you balance, to help you process, and I appreciate that they've put that there. This is a museum that is opening soon, I believe later this year in the fall. It's called the Greenwood Rising Museum, and it tells the story of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. This was designed by a company called Local Projects. They're prominent exhibit designers. They also designed the 9/11 Memorial. And from what I have heard, and this is more of a exhibit rendering, there's going to be two directions that you can move through the space. One is just to learn the story of the town, Black Wall Street, the businesses that were there. The other is the more visceral experience where you will experience the burning and the chaos when Black Wall Street was destroyed, and you will see and smell and hear things all around you that mimic that experience. So another one to grow on. And lastly, Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York. I've curated in this space and know other folks who have worked here. And this is not the whole angle of it. This is the kind of interior, newer facade, and there's an atrium. But Weeksville is ultimately a freedom colony. So it is a set of houses that existed for Black people who were escaping enslavement, looking for freedom that they could live in and be free from slave catchers and other forms of harm. James Weeks, who was a Black businessman, opened the space. He gave houses and land for anyone who wanted it. It was very much a self-determined community, keeping people safe and free, and they still interpret that story today. So those are just some spaces, right? Just thinking of emotions, thinking of architecture, and how that makes a museum a revolutionary icon. Third up to bat, museums that are doing socially responsive programs and the community outreach that is so key nowadays, and the kinds of work that we all appreciate seeing, especially during times when humanity can be at its lowest. I know of many museums that during the height of the pandemic were giving out PPE, personal protective equipment, were giving out groceries, baby diapers, and other things. That museums that had gardens would let people take from the garden what was farmed and just freely have. You know, it wasn't about buy a ticket, take a tour, right? It was, you are human, I am human, we're going through a shared experience, we're gonna come together and fight for what's right and look out for one another, that good neighbor ethos. This person from the Visitors of Color blog says, I would like to find more questions than answers at a museum. I think those moments can be transformational, and that begins with an environment that welcomes some degree of participation. Education is always a two-way road. So while they're reflecting on education, the same could be said about outreach. One of the things about community outreach is you need to know who you're reaching out to. You need to understand what they need. So you can't just start by going in and saying, we're going to help you. Certainly that's not the best approach, but rather asking, what is the help you need? What are the experiences you've had with the museum? And how can we pull that all together? To that point, my current job at Historic Germantown is to do that work. And we are interpreting and preserving and amplifying history and nature and culture across 18 sites in Northwest Philadelphia. So we have arboretums and cemeteries, historic houses. There's a paper mill. There's all kinds of different sites that are part of our consortium, and we're trying to make sure that everyone shines and everyone gets the visits and everyone gets the press, and that we meet the needs of all the people in those 18 different communities. So starting this summer into next year, we're excited to be working with the Pew Charitable Trust to do intensive community outreach, especially around our green spaces. Most of the historic sites have a green park-like space attached. We're opening up the gates, opening the doors. We want everyone to access that, especially now that people are feeling a little less, maybe not less cautious, but a little more eager to go outside and enjoy the fresh air and the sunshine. And so opening up our green spaces, we're doing a lot of survey work to find out what people need, and we're going to create 18 different community engagement plans for those 18 different communities. The Speed Museum. This is an image of Breonna Taylor, an African-American woman who was also killed, I believe, in 2020 during the height of many of the Black Lives Matter protests, and she was killed by police as she slept in her home. And so the museum in her neck of the woods in Louisville, Kentucky, they put up an exhibit in conjunction with her mom to honor her life and to honor all that was left behind and to mark that moment in time. The exhibit is called Promise, Witness, Remembrance. There's some great video of it online if you want to see it. Some very noted artists contributed work, and most notably Amy Sherald, who created this image for the Speed, and the Smithsonian debuted this work here. So just really powerful stuff, just marking what is happening in the world and commemorating when people are lost. I think that is good and righteous to do for a museum. The Anacostia Museum, part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. and Southeast, has been really doing exciting work. Certainly, they have a new director, Dr. Melanie Adams, and she has hit the ground running looking at what they'll do as a social justice focus each year. And this year they're looking at food justice. So they have a new exhibit called Food for the People that is outside of the museum. When things were first happening in the pandemic, they had to keep the inside closed, but they started mounting exhibits outside in the parking lot just so everyone could access it, so everyone could still get the learning and understanding and have the feedback. And so the first exhibit they put up in their outdoor spaces in their community was called Men of Change, celebrating African American men as change makers. And that exhibit has traveled to many other spaces. And this was supposed to be indoors. They put it up outdoors. It was a success. And now they have Food for the People as another offering outdoors. The Queens Museum in New York City, they have been doing amazing work, and they have something called a cultural food pantry. Just like it sounds, you can come, you can get food, you can get exposed to culture. The Queens Museum is always free. They've underwritten the ticket price, and they are doing just some really dynamic things in a community that's largely full of immigrants. Queens has one of the most diverse populations with most languages spoken, and they're doing that work to make sure everyone is fed and everyone is exposed to culture. Lastly, when we think of museums as revolutionary icons, just thinking about the way that things are acquired and ethical returns. That is a term that I've just become familiar with as the Smithsonian just released a policy, and repatriation. So this person from the Visitors of Color blog says, "It hit me that sometimes I hate going into museums because I question where everything came from. Take a Ming era vase. Was it bought or was it smuggled out? Who was it taken from, and why is it that things that are donated by rich white people? I want to know the history of those things." Questions that many people might ask when they see an item and a name of a collector or a donor attached to it. And of course, if you're not in the museum world, you might wonder, like, how did they get that? And how do they afford it? And why is the museum showing that and not other things? All very valid questions. So the Smithsonian recently convened a group of curators and scholars over the last year to think about what they would do as their own policy for return. repatriation and restitution. And they have come up with a very brilliant policy. Also, it is publicly accessible. One of the first of the units, we call it units, the first museum in the Smithsonian that's going to champion this is the National Museum of African Art. Their new director, Nayari Blankenberg, is from the continent and felt very passionately about returning the Benin bronzes that are in their collection. And so that's been announced, and she's been speaking about that. And Secretary Lonnie Bunch, who is, the highest ranking official in the institution, has shared his feelings about ethical returns. He says there's a growing understanding at the Smithsonian and in the world that museums generally have possessions, and the collections carry a certain ethical obligation to the places and people where the collections originated. Among these obligations is to consider using our contemporary moral norms. What should be in our collection and what should not? This new policy on ethical returns is an expression of our commitment to meet these obligations. So it's exciting to see that is always in discussion and that is finally getting to be forefronted and mainstreamed in the museum practice. Another exciting thing is the digitization of items, digital asset management, and digitizing 3D often items is a way that even if an item is in a collection and it is returned to its source community, the learning and the digital footprint can still be there for future generations. And this project called Scan the World is part of the many spaces that are doing that work to digitize and make things open access. Also, Google Arts and Culture is another app that does that. So, in closing, I believe that museums have to be spaces for community care. This is a theory I talked about back in 2017 at the Museum Next conference, again, when it wasn't as popular to do so, but nonetheless, what is community care, right? It's used in many different ways by many different industries. The way that I'm defining it is a practice in museums that honors our humanity, centering advocacy and empathy and social responsibility. Community care embraces our partnerships, our programs, our visitors, our community, and of course, ourselves. And that has to be the way that we move forward, thinking about community engagement, thinking about co-creation, and thinking about how museums can be revolutionary icons. Thank you very much.